so that the filibustering begin.
I rise today to begin to filibuster. I will speak until I can no longer speak. I will speak as long as it takes.
I'm prepared to stand on this floor and talk about the need for this body to come together for frankly as long as I can, because I know that we can come together on this issue.
You can call what I'm doing today whatever you want. You can call it a filibuster. You can call it a very long speech. I'm not here to set any great records or to make a spectacle. I am simply here today to take as long as I can to explain to the American people the fact that we have got to do a lot better. Now let me just enumerate some of the reasons.
We're engaged in a filibuster, a way to divert attention from what we're doing today, to obstruct, and that's what's going on today.
Hello and welcome to Filibustering History, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, lead faculty for the history program at Southern New Hampshire University's College of Online and Continuing Education. Today we're shaking things up a bit. James Fennessy, the Associate Dean of Faculty for History at SNHU, and I are talking to Dan Peters, the Research and Facilities Manager for the Manchester Historic Association. In a first, for us at least, all three of us are in the same room for this conversation, at the association's Research Center. Normally, these things only happen through the magic of Skype and the internet, but for this episode, we got to stare at each other awkwardly while talking about Dan's academic and professional background, the Manchester Historic Association itself, and the benefits of studying local history. What is your name and what do you do?
My name is Daniel Peters. I am the Research and Facilities Manager here at the Manchester Historic Association. I basically do a lot of different things because the organization I work for is a small institution, so there's only 4 full-timers. My responsibilities include everything from working in the library to handling artifacts to managing the property. We own a couple properties and managing the gift shop and all the stuff in our museum. So I have a pretty broad range of responsibilities, but of course the favorite part is actually working in the library and with original artifacts.
Right, yeah. Daniel, could you tell us a little bit about your background? So, how you developed an interest in history, your education, and then, we can segue into how you moved into this role.
Okay, yeah. So I actually probably started when I was much younger. My dad actually worked for the airlines, and I was homeschooled. So we could pretty much fly for nothing anywhere around the country. So my father was the history teacher. We'd actually go to battlefields if we're talking about Antietam or Gettysburg or Manassas and stuff like that. So we actually go to different historic places or historic buildings, D.C. to visit the Smithsonian and that kind of stuff. I kind of started it, and I think later on when I was in the service, I got sent over to Afghanistan, and one of the keystone things that really left a big impression on me is that we got stationed to one of the last castles Alexander the Great built before he died in Afghanistan. And it was kind of like the homecoming because the base was right next to it. So like when the mission was almost over, you're coming home, you can see the castle, that means you're almost there.
That is awesome.
So that kind of really pushed me into like really appreciating like not only the military history, but the history in general of like really being excited about what actually surrounds me on a daily basis. Which kind of leads me into why I chose the path of my education I did. I started off getting my undergrad at SNU, actually here on campus in Manchester. So when I was done with that, I decided that I wanted to do something focused on local history. And, well, SNU happened to have the public history program, which ended up being exactly what I needed. So,
did you do that as part of the GI Bill after, or had you gone to university first and then enlisted?
No, I did have some college credits because I took some before I left the service and then some when I was in. But I did pay to the GI Bill, and actually between the GI Bill and the Yellow Ribbon program that SNU offers, I ended up paying, I think I only paid for one semester, my master's, because of the way it worked out. So, because I had enough credits going in to really
even
help
better.
me. Yeah,
right on.
Yeah.
So we're sitting in the Manchester Historic Association's, this is the reading room in the Research Center, right?
Correct.
So
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about this place?
So this is what this building was originally built for us by a local businessman. His name is Frank Carpenter. He's a very important figure in the city. He built several of the major public institutions in the city, like the city library and the post office and stuff like that. So in 1931, he actually had this building built for us and gave it to us. So this is kind of where our organization has been ever since. It's kind of our home, and we've been here for a long time. Before we opened the Millie Art Museum, this is where the museum was, and that was up until even the 2000s. So this is just even in fairly recent history that we've grown into multiple locations. This building currently is now just our archive. So people come here to do research and kind of everything related to Manchester. So that's kind of our mission, is to collect, preserve, and share. So it's always important to be aware of the share part, right? We can't just be hoarders.
Right.
So that's kind of the purpose of this building now. It's been remodeled with that in mind. So,
could you talk a bit about actually your transition into this role from SNU's amazing public history program? So how does
plug?
Yeah, exactly. How did that program and your capstone and all of the work that you did prepare you for this role? And then how did you get into this role? What did that look like?
Yeah, I actually got this job because I started off in community college, working, taking a history class, and I had a professor that encouraged me to take an internship in one of the areas. So they liked me so much after the internship, they hired me on part-time. But when I transferred to the SNU, I started getting more interested in history, and so that built on them giving me more responsibilities here. And as the need arose, they actually kept adding on to it and allowing me to do small exhibits here and there. And then when I was finishing up my master's program, instead of just writing a paper, I chose to do the exhibit part instead, and for my capstone. And they actually allowed me to put my exhibit on display, which they were so impressed with what I was able to pull out of their collection that they hired me full time after that. So
that's fantastic. So note to students, your history degrees and things that you produce are practical.
Yes, absolutely.
And can actually get you a job.
Yeah. So make sure you don't be afraid to share it. Yeah.
What was the topic of the exhibit?
So my exhibit was focused on Manchester during the First World War. It looked at different organizations in the community, what they were doing to either support or kind of cope with what was going on in the national scheme of things. Manchester is kind of an interesting place in that time period because that's the height of the Amscake Manufacturing Company, which is the main employer here in town. So there's 17,000 people that were employed for just that one company here in town, and they were very encouraging of people to go into the service and support of that. They did fundraisers and food drives and stuff like that to help support the troops. And it's interesting to kind of look at it through objects and photographs in that kind of aspect. I didn't do a lot of text because then you have to get into interpretation a lot more. But I like to, when I do exhibits, do a lot of the object type stuff. And we've got tons of that kind of stuff in our collection. For some reason, we have a lot on that time period, which is not a period that a lot of historians look at. Usually it's World War II because we were much more involved in that. But it was an interesting way of looking at the community and how they pulled together or were doing things to cope with what was going on in the world around them.
You mentioned that you weren't using too many paper documents because of interpretation and all of that, but it's still using photos and all that. I imagine you're still crafting a story, and so how does that kind of play into what you're doing there?
So I still wrote a paper for it. I still had to use the historic method of proving what I was saying. Sure. So there was a paper that went along with the background of it, but when I was referring to the text part, I basically just tried to describe what objects were and setting up the exhibit to allow people to kind of really understand what was going on based on all the research I had done, all the documents I've read, all the accounts that I read from the time. We've got diaries from soldiers that went and served in the 103rd, which was part of the Yankee Division, which is the New England regiment that was heavily involved in a lot of the fighting over in Europe at that time period. So a lot of that division, even though it was under main officer's command, was from New Hampshire. And in fact, pretty much the entire headquarters company was from Manchester. So there was a lot of New Hampshire representative in that unit that we talk about a lot in that history. So it's interesting to see how much an impact New Hampshire itself has, not only New Hampshire but Manchester, but on those type of events, because you don't really think of it as a major state and a major player in that aspect. But a lot of times they've done a lot of the grunt work. Even looking back into the Civil War and other wars, and the Philippine War and all that stuff, they've supplied a lot of important leaders and had an impact on the world in a way that I guess some people don't even think about. So it's what's kind of interesting about doing this type of exhibits is putting basic history out there about them, because I've found in my experience so far that a lot of people don't want to read a lot of text, and that's part of the other reason I don't do it. It's because if I'm going to put the effort in, I want somebody to care. Yeah. It's still important to make sure that you are documenting and you know what you're saying, because there's always going to be somebody who knows more about the subject than you are, and it's going to come through and be like, actually, you got that wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's not what you wanted.
Yeah.
Were you always, say, a local history nerd, or was it as you started to study history and see all of these connections that Manchester and New Hampshire had to larger history that really focused you in on local history? Or was it sort of branching out? You were interested in the local history of where you came from, and then you started to see all of these connections. And I mean nerd in a very nice way.
Yeah, no. My family's not from New England. Actually, both my parents are both from both sides are from the South. My dad's family's from Louisiana. My mom's family's from Texas. We moved up here because of when my dad was working for airlines. They closed the station he was working at down in Austin, Texas, and we moved up here. So I've been up here since I was probably like 12-ish. I think when we moved around that time period, 1998. So it was I think it was around 12 years old.
Okay.
At that point. I think what it started is having a fascination with history in general, especially because of my military influence, and my father was in the Navy and my grandfather was in the Air Force, so we come from a long line of family military tradition. That inspired more of my interest of military history, and then I think when I was overseas, I kind of realized how surrounded we really are with history, and we walk by statues in parks that are dedicated to people that we never think twice about every day, and that's what really kind of drew my interest into local history. Just realizing that we're surrounded by it on a daily basis.
So you were working part-time, and then you did the capstone project for SNHU, and then they brought you in full-time.
Yep.
So what does a day in your life look like here at the association?
Depends on which day you're talking about.
Okay, fair enough.
So because I have so many different things we're working on, each day is a little different, which is kind of what I like about it in a lot of ways. I could be doing anything, for example, if I'm here on a Wednesday or Saturday, I'm running the research center, which is this building that we're in currently. I could be helping, somebody doing research for a book, or somebody who's interested in their genealogy, or looking at their history of their property, or people from different countries want to see some of the artifacts we have, the old maps we have, because we've got maps of New Hampshire dating back to the 18th century, so we've got quite a collection of that. Usually people travel up here to mostly for genealogy, because they had relatives that either worked in the mills. We've got all their original papers, that kind of stuff. So that could be fun. And then the rest of the week, I'm over at my office at the museum, which basically you could be doing anything from getting tours to, make sure that all the lights are up and running in the museum, make sure that it's clean and it looks good, and that kind of stuff, or ordering new stuff for the gift shop, or doing research on that, trying to figure out what kind of new item can we carry, so people actually want to buy something from us. So it's a wide range of different responsibilities, and that's kind of what I like about it.
So you wear many hats.
Oh yeah. Man of many hats. Yes.
So you were showing us some of the textile samples that I can't remember. Were they from the late 19th century?
Yes, a Both the ones I showed you were both from the mid to late 19th century.
Okay, so, and I mean, the colors and the way that they're preserved are absolutely amazing. So, two-part question. What is, I won't say the most interesting artifact that you've come across, but what are some of the most interesting artifacts that you've come across in your role? And who are some of the most interesting people or interactions that you've had with people coming to study local history?
Well, the second part is a tough question. I'll start with the first one. Yeah, we've got all kinds of interesting artifacts in our collection and stuff that, you don't, probably 40 or 50 years ago, you wouldn't have thought twice about how precious that might end up being. I think probably a good example of that is we just did a flag exhibit not too long ago, this past fall, and it was centered around a flag that Teddy Roosevelt's wife, actually hand-stitched, which is on display at the museum right now, that we didn't know we had in our collection until it got damaged. It's one of those horror stories that you'd never want to hear happen in an archive type job, is that you come into work one day and find that this artifact you didn't know you had that was one of a kind, it was damaged. Ugh. So we actually paid to have it restored. We raised a bunch of money to help save the flag and stuff like that. So it was a flag that she had actually handmade for a group called the Sons of Veterans, which is the Sons of the Union Veterans from the Civil War. They had their own club, and they actually wrote to her in 1903 and asked her for something to raffle off to raise money for their organization at one of their fairs. When they got it and they realized that she hand-stitched it, they wrote her back and said, well, can we please keep this? So when they closed up, apparently they gave that flag to us, and we never really fully realized what it was, I think, until recently. So wow. It's got a hand-stitched portrait of George Washington in the middle of it. It's only got 45 stars on it, the flag. It was done in the early 20th century. So
wow.
So it's on display. If you get a chance to this weekend, you should go check it out. So
yeah, hopefully. Yeah. That'd be awesome. Yeah. So
it's part of our permanent display now.
Yeah, I bet.
So the second part of that question was the characters that you come across in this role. Guilty by not naming names, but
we do have some pretty interesting people come in. I've had people come in asking me about secret bunkers that were built under the city, which they were referring to, like the old canal system that they built for the textile manufacturing companies that were here. There's even some sections of the city where they couldn't really do anything about a brook or something like that, so they just basically built a tunnel over it. But this guy was convinced that it was some secret plot that for the elite to, hide in case there's a nuclear war during the Cold War. And I was like, okay, sure. There was a incident in the 70s where there was an anthrax outbreak at one of the manufacturing companies here. It's actually the only naturally occurring incidence of anthrax outbreak in the United States, where this company was doing textile type stuff, had imported some wool from Europe that had anthrax spores in it, and that got infested in the building. And they tried for 10 years to purify the building, and there was like 6 people that got sick, and I think a couple people died. And so I've had people come in asking about that, thinking it's a big cover-up, and that it was on purpose, that there was some secret government plan to develop the art. Like, there's no documented proof of that, but I don't mean to belittle people's suspicions, but sometimes the people come in and asking pretty random questions like that, and it's like, you really think that's true? I don't know.
That's how research questions start, and then you do the research, and hopefully you can dispel the craziness,
right?
If it's not true.
Yeah, or hopefully the research leads that person into a more
reasonable answer. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Different question or something. Yeah.
Based on everything I've seen for documentation on that incident, I think it was not on purpose. I don't think they really understood what they were doing until it was too late. So, I mean, you're talking in the 1960s where they didn't even really understand some of the insulation they were using was bad for you. So
so you've been working here for a few years, and so where do you see this institution going over the next few years?
I feel like we're becoming more popular, especially in the States. So I think that's important for our organization, is being recognized as a solid institution and a good good asset for people to trust to come in and look at some pretty one-of-a-kind artifacts that related to the city's history. In that same aspect, we're working really hard on improving our education piece of it. So we're trying really hard to make sure that all the school kids in the area get a chance to come in and see the museum. It's one thing that a lot of companies in the area like to donate to is giving us grants for because in New Hampshire in fourth grade you study New Hampshire history. So I always try to encourage the public schools and private schools to come in and do that by using that grant money to say, hey, we'll pay for the buses, or we'll pay for the tours, and all you gotta do is get the kids here,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're working on that, and then we're trying to really improve our footprint in not only for New Hampshire but for New England of being an important institution. So I think we're growing and moving towards that direction.
Yes. That was going to be my next question, because being coming from a history background, it's not always a discipline where there's a lot of money. So how does one fund and maintain a historic association?
Yeah, especially one like ours, which we're a completely nonprofit 501(c) organization. So we're not supported by any government institution or whatnot. So we're completely dependent on people giving us donations or being members. Our membership is important to us too. So our business partnership is also another big thing that way we really are able to maintain ourselves. We are fortunate enough to be old enough that we have some endowments from some people, but there's only so much you can draw on those a year, and really you don't want to be drawing too much on those, because that's your, something happens, that's your backup money. So we work really hard to make sure that we offer a program that people are willing to come and visit and do. We do walking tours and stuff like that too of the different sites around the city, and we work with the New Hampshire Heritage Trail, which is basically an alliance with all the museums in the state of New Hampshire to help promote each other. We do exchange membership programs with some of the different museums in the area. We're also involved in the New England Museum Association, trying to build our relationship with not just New Hampshire museums, but with other museums and institutions like ours that have museums and archives. Sometimes you have one or the other, not both. So there's that too. Is that we've got both sides of those that we have to try to build relationships with. I actually also sit on the New Hampshire Archive Board, New Hampshire Archive Group Board, which is an organization that exists for the purpose of encouraging some of the smaller historical societies in New Hampshire how to do better practices with their collections, preserving their history, and helping them, because a lot of them are volunteer-based. So we run workshops twice a year with the purpose of teaching them more about the proper techniques of how to do displays, and that's actually what our next workshop is going to be on, is on exhibiting. And then I think last year we did disaster planning in the fall. So trying to help smaller institutions have the means to really do what they can to be better about growing and maintaining their collections. So
yeah, that's very cool. One of the public history courses talks about disaster management and all of
yeah,
that.
Yeah, it does.
Trying to blank on which course it was, but yeah, it's interesting.
It was the archive class.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. One of the things that always occurs to me when I come into a place like this is that it always amazes me how rarely students take advantage of places like this.
Yeah.
And so it's great. I'm tickled that you use this place for your capstone and all of that, because it's always difficult for undergrad and graduate students when they're coming with a capstone project. A lot of them always want to do some big national thing, like the Civil War or something.
Yeah.
When in reality, and then the problem is always getting them access to sources that haven't been used a million times, because the Civil War has a whole bunch of sources online, but everybody uses those, and so you always want students to go to some sort of physical archive to find the stuff that's not digitized. And these are the types of places that students really need to be going. And they need to focus. I always encourage students to focus on, pick something local that you can drive to, that you can get all the, because you've got so many things here that would be, you've got a million capstone projects in the making here. So It's always amazing to come into these places and realize just how many types of sources you have and the volume of sources that you have, because just like you were showing us down below before, you've got all those just fire alarm records from multiple years, and so you've got so many sources of information that I think students tend to not think about, and I think that's a shame.
Well, and especially for people in this area, I mean, we're right across the street from the public library. They also have a room that specializes in New Hampshire history. So you can literally come here one day and then walk across the street and go to the library, and then you have a whole different set of archive that you can look through. And that's so true. I think there's a misconception, and especially with students, a lot of my classmates when I was doing my undergrad were always wanting to do the broad scheme things. I have one guy in my undergrad that did something on Lewis and Clark, which is great, but who hasn't done something on Lewis and Clark?
Exactly.
When in your own library in each of your towns, they have all these information that nobody looks at, and it's probably just going to deteriorate unless somebody writes about it.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that people need to understand, is that we already know what happened nationally. We need to preserve the side stories. That's kind of the whole point of public history in a lot of ways, right? So
yeah, I think that's something that we definitely can do better at teaching students, is that history isn't just national politics or something like national, political movements or social movements or anything like that. History is also local.
Yeah, think local.
Yeah, think local. I mean, you mentioned that you've got a lot of sources going back to the 18th century, but you also have some Native American artifacts that go back 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of history no matter where you are. And so you can get to know your local area and go to your local resources like this.
But it's also fascinating because students struggle all the time trying to come up with a very specific topic, right? They're like, I'm interested in this, and it's just like World War II, but what are you interested in? And if you go to the archive, like, who would ever think to do a project on if you're looking like the fire alarm records downstairs, if you just sit down and you have no idea what you want to do a project on, but you're looking around in an archive and something looks interesting to you and you open it up, it can just spark that inspiration. You can be like, oh, well, maybe I should do a project on this. I have the records right here, the actual physical records.
Well, the whole reason I started with my capstone is because I started looking at all the city parks, and there's a park here in Manchester that's named Sweeney Park, which, after looking into it, it was named for Henry Sweeney, who was the first Manchester man to be killed in the First World War. So there's also Sweeney Post, which is the American Legion post here in town. So why the heck did anybody decide to name a huge piece of landmark and their veterans post after this guy? Well, it turns out he was a popular kid in the area, and he was well known and well liked, and there was a huge parade that went downtown when they brought his body back, and like well documented and stuff like that. It's like, if you're interested in World War II, I mean, some of those guys are still around. You could go and actually get some oral history from them before it's too late. Korea would be another one. I mean, those are the guys are going to be the next up the line to be going, if that's the type of military history you're in. I find that even just being here, that talking to people who've either lived in the city for a long time and whatnot, it's just fascinating. I remember when I was actually in Boy Scouts, one of my mentors in Boy Scouts was actually he was telling me one time about when the circus would come to town. Before the Verizon Center was there, or it's now the SNU Arena. I should correct myself.
Yeah, get it right.
Yeah, especially with you guys sitting here. So he was telling me that there used to be a parking lot with Zaylers, and that's where the circus would come and perform. And when he was a little boy, and this is the 1930s, one of the animal handlers just handed him an elephant and told him to walk it up the street.
What?
Yeah. So he's got this fond memory of walking an elephant up, one of the major streets here in town, to take it to the circus. I mean, he's like, what kind of story can you get that from nowadays? I mean, circus doesn't exist anymore.
Now we have this new arena, so instead of a circus coming through, you have like monster trucks or Janet Jackson.
Yeah,
Janet Jackson's not going to come down.
WWE coming in a couple weeks,
Janet Jackson will ask you to hold her hand and walk her down the street.
So this has been a really cool experience, and if we have a few minutes, it'd be cool to see some of the other stuff. But
sure.
Do you have something you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, actually, we have a display on right now. It's called Manchester's Masters, which is focuses on 6 different artists from Manchester that either painted important people from New Hampshire or some of them were even held positions in the federal government and stuff like that, or they were famous for one reason or another. Their style of art, style of painting or whatnot. So that's on display now. And then the next exhibit is actually going to be a larger version of my master's thesis based around World War One. And we're going to be pulling out all kinds of cool artifacts. And we've got a trench gun in our collection and all kinds of stuff like that. So
very cool.
Yeah, so those are my 2 plugs.
Okay, good. Nice. James, do you have anything for us?
Sure. I would just recommend the Manchester Historic Association in general. If you happen to make it to town, there are so many great artifacts here and people, obviously, who are extremely knowledgeable and can tell you about local history and show you around. If you can't make it to Manchester, then not every local historic association is going to be of this caliber and with such amazing people, but I do suggest visiting that because it really can spark some inspiration.
Always go local.
Yeah.
I'm just going to recommend the cool thing that Daniel found for me. As everybody knows on here, I think I recommended just Ulysses S. Grant in one episode here, but they have a fabric swath, I guess you would call it?
Yeah, swatch book, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Where one of the local fabric companies created for the Ulysses S. Grant, was it the campaign of...
Campaign when he ran for president, yeah.
Okay. So a campaign from 1868, and we'll post a picture of me looking at it thoughtfully on the Twitter page. All right, well, Daniel, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments on this podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please send me an email at snhuhistory@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at filibusterhist. For James Fennessy and Daniel Peters, I'm Rob Denning. Have a good day.
Daniel, could you tell us a little bit about your All right.
It's weird being able to see everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Usually I'm able to just stare at a wall or something.
Yeah, I just have my headset. So